She was a barnstormer, a record breaker, fashion mogul, and somehow still had the time to take Eleanor Roosevelt on a joyride over DC. Amelia Earhart wasn't just flying planes, she was flying past expectations. Before she vanished over the Pacific, she had already carved her name into the sky through sheer will, guts, and uncanny ability to look a male dominated field dead in the eye and say, "Cool story, bro. I'm doing it anyway." She didn't actually say that, but in this episode, we're taking off from her Kansas childhood and flying straight through the early stunt flights, record breaking solo missions, her rise to international celebrity, and that final attempt to circle the globe. We'll dive into the technology of the time, the logistical challenges, the critics, and the champions. And yes, we'll get into the theories because how could we not? And she didn't just disappear, she became a legend. So grab your goggles and true that compass because when the story flies this high, you know we've got a lot to cover. This is The Remedial Scholar.
That's ancient history.
I feel I was denied critical, need to know information.
Belongs in a museum, bro.
Stop skipping your remedial class.
Holy smokes. Welcome to The Remedial Scholar. I am Levi. Thank you for joining me on this high-flying episode. I know I say this pretty much every time, but I am very excited. I think it would be weird and sad if I wasn't, though, so there's that. Before we get too far along into this, I'll be honest, this is a behemoth of an episode. There's a couple things I want to say. One, thank you to everyone who has been watching the show on YouTube. I'm going to be trying something different with how I do the video, so I think you're going to like it. Let me know if you don't, I guess, but if you're listening, that's fine. Keep on listening. I would say just go and check out the video when or if you want to. Secondly, if you're a returning listener and have thus far enjoyed the show, do me a favor, a kindness, and review us wherever possible. That helps all the new folks find the show and, trying to do this a little more grassroots as much as I can anyway. Lastly, I love you. Okay, on to the episode. This episode, definitely one I have wanted to do for a very long time now. There are countless documentaries, YouTube videos, and podcasts about Amelia. Books, TV shows, movies, and more, all trying to understand the mystery of her tragic end to the triumphant life she seemed to have. Passion, fearlessness, adventure, and a mission of equality all seem to flow through her blood. We know this because of a not-so-distant relative of hers, Dale Earnhardt. He would be a fearless and passionate part of his own sport. No, there's no documented relation between the two. Although their spirits are very similar, and fates also, unfortunately, too similar. Their surnames do share a commonality, though. I spent way more time than I'd like to admit trying to find a distant relative shared between them. But that's okay. Their names, Earhart and Earnhardt, respectively, do come from Germany. The root of the name comes from an old German or Bavarian term for very honorable. The compound of air, or honor, and heart, strong or firm. So Earnhardt is a variation of that, and both legends' ancestors shared some very similar immigration patterns as well, so that's kind of cool. Also, another cool link is that Dale Earnhardt Jr. had a car named Amelia, which was a specific chassis that he raced a few times, and it was allegedly his favorite one. And I have to wonder how much of their family believed there to be a bigger connection to Amelia. But in any regard, Amelia was a trailblazer all on her own. She not only knocked down barriers for future female aviators, but she really did it for many women in all sorts of different jobs. Obviously, she was not the driving force behind it, but a piece in a larger, more intricate web of the women who inspired other women to step out from the shadows of the men of the world and go, hey, we can do things too. I know it's not that odd in today's world to have women doing things, unless you are that sheltered or whatever. I also don't want this to come off as preachy because honestly, it should not be a shock to have women doing jobs that men traditionally do. There's little reason in this day and age that there should be any separation. There's obvious examples, but for the most part, who cares? Like, if they're qualified, let them do it. Women have proven time and time again that they are statistically more emotionally regulated, intelligent, and they can see more colors than us. Sounds like it'll be okay. Anyway, enough pontificating. Like I said, this isn't that strange to me, and I think anyone who cares about what people doing certain jobs have between their legs have issues to work out all on their own. I say all of this to paint a picture because more and more women are in jobs that men typically dominate, and this is relatively new. In the history of humans, women did deviate from societal norms, but more often than not, it was status quo. Early 1900s, no exception. And I'll get into some contemporary accounts and responses to what people like Amelia were doing that back then. But just know that there's little in terms of equal opportunity in this story because that's kind of how things were. People like Amelia, like Bessie Coleman, Marie Curie, Jacqueline Cochran, Margaret Sanger, and Josephine Baker were actively chipping away at those types of barriers, though. All right, moving on from that, let's talk about the flight log of today's episode. Before we get into Amelia's story, going to give a little summary of the history of flight before our girl arrives on the scene. Then, a little refresher on radio technology because that's actually a huge part of this story. And then we get into Amelia, her life up until the final voyage. And then for that, we're going to be going day by day breakdown of events. Then final transmissions before transitioning into some theories and evidence behind them. Sound good? Great. Let's get into it. This episode scratches a few itches for me. History, obviously. Mysteries, also great and fun to learn about. Bigger part, and maybe one that you guys don't know about me just yet, but aviation. I love airplanes. I do not know a ton about every single one of them, but I do know that I always thought being a pilot would be super awesome. When I joined the Navy, I wanted to work on airplanes. Humble brag moment, but I scored so high on the ASVAB, the entry basic knowledge test that they used to decide where to put you. I scored high enough that they wanted me to try again to get a higher score so that they could try and get me into the nuclear power plant field. I was not interested. My recruiter was like, hey, that score's good if you get you can get any job you want pretty much, but if you want to study, take it again, you could go nuke. You know, get a nice enlistment bonus. I think it was like 90,000 at the time. I shot it down right away. So that should also tell you a little bit about me. But I was like, nope, I want to work on airplanes. And you might ask yourself, why would Levi join the Navy? If he loved airplanes so much, why not join the Air Force? Well, the answer is 2 for the price of 1. Quick answer, they had a long wait time before they were sending people to basic training, and I wanted to leave as soon as possible. And 2, my grandpa and my uncle were both in the Navy, and I always thought that was awesome. So I got to pick my job, aviation structural mechanic. I did maintenance on fighter jets, pretty sick. Got to travel all over and met some alright people along the way. But most importantly, I got to work on airplanes. I loved it. Even when I hated it, I loved it. One day, I do want to get my pilot's license or at least try, take flying lessons, something. That's not part of today's story. Basically, all of that to say, I enjoy all aspects of flight, and I think it's awesome, and I never got to dive really deep into the history of aviation like I did for this episode, so that's why it's very front-heavy with aviation history. I also should tell you, final thought before the show begins for real. In prep for this episode, I flew Amelia's route, the final route, on Microsoft Flight Simulator. I even paid for a custom plane, a community-made version of the Lockheed Electra that she flew. And I gotta tell you, super boring. I got to fly it on my computer with 2 monitors so I could watch Seinfeld on the other screen and have some entertainment, because you might be surprised to know this, there was no in-flight movies for her and Fred. They didn't get to hit autopilot and go heat up some Hot Pockets. They were in it to win it, and you kind of have to be to do something this crazy. These distances, they're insane, even in the game. I mean, granted, the game is supposed to be a 1-to-1 scale, right? But it is so freaking long. Even with all my creature comforts that I could enjoy while flying, I still have tremendous respect for them because I was still like, all right, well, kind of wish this plane was a little bit faster. And to top it all off, I don't know, the tuning for the plane that I bought to do this, super wonked. It kept veering off to the left every time I tried to take off, crashed a super ton. It's infinitely harder for the actual pilots to control them. I have a controller and I was struggling, so that tells you anything. Even the other model, there's one that was supposed to be exactly like her plane, tuned and everything. And then there was another version that was like the Electra back then. And then there's another version that's like a modern retrofitted Electra. And I could get the other two to fly, but not her. So I don't know if they were a little tongue-in-cheek in that or what. But anyway, not an easy time for me on my computer game. So there's a lot of respect for what they tried to accomplish, what they did accomplish, and all other pioneers in aviation accomplished. Because that's insane to think about. And, you know, they basically just did it for the love of the game. Like, they were excited, they're doing new things, seeing new stuff, just in awe pretty much all the time. All right, a lot of setup here's a little more. People have pretty much had a desire to fly for a long, long time. I don't know if it's just the instinctual call of the void, the phenomenon experienced when standing near a ledge and wondering what it would be like to jump. It's not a suicidal thing, but a legitimate thing that happens in pretty much all of us, though the science hasn't been studied very much, as it's kind of a recent discovery. A 2012 study published in the Journal of Affective Disorders surveyed around 400 students, and over half of them responded positively to having thoughts of leaping off a high place and also not having suicidal thoughts. 75% of the student body responded positively to both. So what that boils down to is there's a lot of people who want to jump off at a high place at least one time, but that doesn't mean they are overly depressed. Just a little curious. That same study indicated that there were people who said they were less anxious in general, had less experience in the feeling of the call of the void, but people who said they had a higher levels of anxiety more likely to experience it. People who are more nervous about more things feel this more often than less anxious people. And that feels pretty odd and backwards, but that's what it is, backwards brain stuff. The researchers hypothesized that this could be a misinterpreted safety signal of the brain. Rather than what your brain naturally does, this phenomenon makes it so your brain tells you to jump instead of not to fall. Touch the hot thing you can already feel the heat from, that kind of stuff. It momentarily flips the script and makes you want to do the bad thing. This is like intrusive thoughts, right? What does that have to do with flight? Well, my hypothesis is that through that phenomenon, humans have invented aviation. It is the adrenaline junkie's dream to jump off a tall thing, be up super high, and also know you'll probably live after. I have no science to back this up, but I thought it was funny and just kind of a silly rationalization of how ideas were made. I also think that the call of the void is just kind of an evolutionary trait, part of our old selves that never learned to be wary of the surroundings, right? A little proof of concept for Charles Darwin. So I don't know if that's it, or just genuine human curiosity to try new things or do new things. In either event, the people have been trying to fly forever. Earliest one is Daedalus and Icarus. It obviously didn't go well for anyone until Orville and Wilbur. I don't know why I pronounced their names so funny. Outside of this legend, in medieval Spain in the 9th century was home to one Abbas Infernus. He was not a crazy man or extremely confident jumper. He was a Renaissance man before the Renaissance. He was a polymath, inventor, astronomer, physician, chemist, engineer, Andalusian musician, and a poet. Dude had almost as many hobbies as I do. He attempted to... He didn't have a podcast, though. What's up? He attempted to jump from a considerable distance, poems written about it, and eventually a historian from the 17th century finds one, quoting it in his own notes. Then we find those, and bam, now we know about this guy. Super weird how that plays out. Anyway, kind of an interesting dude in his own right. He had made various versions of things he needed. You know, he made a version of corrected lenses, essentially mostly see-through rocks, right? They're minerals, Marie. Anyway, that could be used to distort things, make them appear bigger to the user. It's kind of weird to think about medieval people needing glasses because not many of them could read. Even weirder to think that before glasses existed, people just held rocks up to their eyes to see better. We've come a long way. Anyway, this guy strapped some feathers to himself and fell pretty much. He was injured, but he lived. So now we have someone doing something crazy and living, sparking more people to do so, trying to improve and not get injured higher, faster, further that they went. Also want to make an observation. This guy was an accomplished tinkerer. He made functioning things, didn't just leap out of a window. He had clocks, devices, even a metronome that he devised. Didn't invent them, didn't create them out of nowhere. But think about this. Back then, if they needed something, they pretty much just invented something, created something. No Amazon, engineers in town weren't exactly always going to be privy to whatever was needed. So crafty people figured it out and then sometimes made things for other people who needed something similar. And then somewhere, you know, along the way, what I'm what I'm getting to is that the idea of inventing a thing out of pure randomness is not necessarily the way things happen. Every invention owes its creation to something that came before it, typically because a newer technology came about to solve a different problem, and then someone appropriated that and made their thing better. It's a constant change and improvement. Here's a quote by Mark Twain that feels appropriate. "There's no such thing as a new idea. It is impossible. We simply take a lot of old ideas and put them into a sort of mental kaleidoscope." Where am I going with this? I don't really know. I was trying to make some sort of connection that back in, Abbas's day, that he was a tinkerer on many hats, and today he would have struggled because so many people rush to put a patent on their ideas, which are just newly rehashed versions of something else, essentially barring anyone from innovating any further. Does this sometimes help small inventor from being Tesla'd by Edison? Yeah, sure, but it also prevents someone like Tesla from being able to experiment with their own ideas on a larger scale. Anyway, soapbox over. Anyway, in the 11th century, a monk named Eilmer strapped wings to his hands and feet and jumped off a church roof. He reportedly flew for 15 glorious seconds before slamming into the ground and breaking both of his legs. Not ideal. Meanwhile, over in China, around 500 BCE, someone invented the first kite, or a kite, which is like the my first aviation kind of kit. It used the basic principles of lift and would later inspire gliders, flying contraptions. Chinese also had an early version of the hot air balloon, those sky lantern things. They're still around today. They're super sick. It's a paper balloon that has like a little candle thing inside, and that hot air from the candle lifts up. There's also stories that armies use them to scare enemies who had never seen floating fire orbs before, which is awesome. All right, and then we get to our boy Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man who invented everything except for chill. Leo sketched helicopters, gliders, and even parachutes. None of them worked because, well, physics, that pesky thing. But the guy was always thinking way ahead of his time. His aerial screw helicopter idea, for example, was supposed to lift via spinning power, but the only power source was muscles. So imagine pedaling a helicopter like a Peloton and hoping for liftoff, but then also you couldn't change course. You could only go forward. So if you wanted to, you couldn't brake or anything. Is not super ideal. But he's kind of thinking three-dimensionally about these kinds of things, about flight. He also had that glider, and I have a tattoo of his glider on my arm. Everybody assumes it's Spider-Man because they can only ever see the bottom part of it, but it's Da Vinci's flying machine because I'm just like that, Jumping forward a few centuries, and hot air balloon. Oh, well, balloons came along, and then hot air balloons spun out of that. So now we have balloon jumping, which is people taking a hot air balloon up and then jumping out. Seems super safe. And then you could start to actually get flight taking shape. George Cayley in the 1800s became a key figure in identifying the four basic forces of flight: lift, drag, thrust, and weight. His gliders worked better than anything else at the time, and even came up with a governable parachute, which is essentially just gliders with better branding, I guess. His work inspired John Stringfellow, who attempted to build a steam-powered flying machine which flew 10 feet, but hey, that's 10 feet more than anybody else managed with steam, so that's pretty cool. 1856, a French guy used a horse to tow his glider, and it worked, sort of, kind of. But the real leap came from Otto Lilienthal in the 1880s. He was dubbed the Glider King. He was the first to fly untethered, repeatedly, with control. He refined the shape of the wings, including the now iconic curved underside, aligning with Bernoulli's principles. He also became first-person photographed mid-glide, which is pretty solid Instagram flex, if it would have been a thing back then. And then America enters the chat. Samuel Langley, big science guy, namesake of several government buildings, built the Aerodrome number 5, a powered but unmanned aircraft that flew over 3,000 feet. Pretty good. The follow-up, Aerodrome number 6, flew nearly 4,700 feet in 1896, and was also photographed by a young man named Alexander Graham Bell. So that's kind of sick. Naturally, U.S. government and military specifically got involved and gave Langley $50,000. That's back then money, so I don't even know if you could. That's a lot. To develop recon gliders for the Spanish-American War. Unfortunately, his bigger versions just kind of fell apart. Scaling up without strengthening things tends to do that. Then in 1901, Gustav Whitehead enters the scene and claims he flew a powered, heavier-than aircraft before the Wright brothers. Did he? Maybe. I don't know. There's a lot of debate. Some people say he flew. Some people say he paid to have it written that he flew. The Smithsonian says no, and they seem pretty trustworthy because they hired Ben Stiller. Of course, the credit goes to the Wright brothers, who on December 17th, 1903, took off in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, not once, but 4 times. They weren't the first to dream of flying, just the first to solve everything at once: lift, control, power, and not dying. After some tweaks, by 1905, Wilbur was flying 24 miles in under 40 minutes. That's practically business class back then, jet lag not included. What followed was global aviation frenzy. France invited the Wrights to Le Mans in 1908, where they basically embarrassed the entire French aviation scene by flying circles, literally circles around them. French inventors just kept at it, though, and soon ailerons were introduced for roll control, making turns smoother and safer. The next big change was the biplane. It's 2 wings stacked on top of each other, 1 motor, and kind of just a lot of guts. This design dominated the next 2 decades. As World War I loomed, these once novel machines became tools of war. Dogfighting was born. Namesakes like Manfred von Richthofen, aka the Red Baron, became legendary. He had 80 confirmed kills before being shot down. His top rival, René Fonck, had 75, but he survived. So, a little complicated scoreboard there. Then the war ended, and with it, the world had thousands of planes and skilled pilots and 0 wars to fly in. So began the golden age of aviation. Military bombers were gutted and turned into airliners. Flights were rough, no pressurization, frigid temperatures, and goggles still very much required, but they flew. In Britain, Handley Page converted warplanes for passenger routes like London to Paris. In France, Louis Blériot, his aircraft company, took off in a big way. In Germany, Junkers introduced the F-13, his first all-metal enclosed passenger aircraft, in 1919. Sleek, efficient, and futuristic looking. America caught up quickly. In 1927, Pan America Airways was founded, initially just flying mail between Key West and Havana. We talked a little bit about them in the defunct companies episode. I don't even remember what the title was, but under the direction of Juan Trippi, it grew into a global airline titan. Pan Am introduced flying boats like the Boeing 314 Clipper. This dominated long-haul routes and later helped launch the jet age with the Boeing 707. They were a blueprint for international air travel, stylish, ambitious, and just kind of a vibe. Behind them stood the big three of American aerospace. McDonnell Aircraft in 1939 specialized in military jets and later merged with Douglas to become McDonnell Douglas, creators of the DC-10 and the F-15 Eagle. Lockheed rolled out planes like the Vega, flown by Amelia eventually, and Constellation, which brought luxury to long-range travel. Boeing started with wooden mail planes, grew into a behemoth from the Model 247 to the dominating B-17 and the iconic 747 jumbo jet, made air travel accessible to millions. Even as aviation became more practical, it never lost its flair. Barnstormers wowed crowds with aerial stunts, and heroes like Charles Lindbergh became household names. It wasn't just the guys making the headlines. While rare, women were also getting into the cockpit too, and they weren't just tagging along. In 1911, Harriet Quimby became the first American woman to earn a pilot's license, and in 1912, she was the first woman to fly solo across the English Channel in a silk flying suit, no less. Then there was Bessie Coleman, who couldn't find a flight school in the United States because she was a woman and also black. So she learned French, went to Paris, earned her license in 1921, came back a barnstorming icon. And they were rewriting expectations of what pilots could be. All of that sets the stage for what would become one of the most iconic figures in aviation, Amelia. All right, so let's go let's do the thing. All right, on to our heroine. Finally, Amelia Mary Dale Earhart was born on July 24th, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. Of course, her middle name wasn't Mary Dale, but I want it to be. I have so many fun ideas that I know I cannot make into merch because of copyright infringement, but I digress. Her father, Samuel Edwin Earhart, was a lawyer, though never having a lot of success. Despite this, her family was respected well enough, her mother even considered by some to be a debutante, high society type. Her father was a lawyer for the railroad, working in claims for them. He also struggled quite a bit with alcoholism, which definitely hindered his upward mobility. This would then cause some financial issues with the family, forcing him to move cities to follow jobs instead of growing within one job itself. Her mother, Amy Otis, came from a respected and wealthy family. She was highly educated, forward-thinking, and her father was a judge, so he did not respect Edwin very much as he struggled in the legal field. He was also a president of the local bank, so, very critical of Eddie. Many outside of her father also felt Amy married beneath her. I also wonder if this story was placed in modern times, if Amy would have been the lawyer and breadwinner. In any event, the progressive nature of Amy, her sense of independence and education instilled the same in her children. She advocated for their independence even as children. She encouraged them to be explorative, adventurous, and in that vein, didn't even care if they wore pants. Yeah, that's right. Women in pants. Amelia herself would still opt for dresses out of a sense of peer pressure, seeing the neighbor girls in dresses and feeling like an outsider because she was wearing pants. I bet. Amelia had just one sister, 2 years her junior, so she had a little buddy to hang out with from an early age, which is good. With the tumultuous nature of their father's employment, the children moved a lot, and at a certain point, it was decided that they would spend a significant amount of time at their maternal grandmother's or grandparents' house where they were homeschooled by old Granny Otis. Amelia was actually named after Granny Otis, so it was Amelia Otis, Amy's mom, and then, anyway. Bouncing back and forth from her parents' home to her grandparents' home was still more stable than just staying with her parents. This explorative and adventurous child thrived on her independence and creativity. After visiting St. Louis earlier in her childhood, Amelia was inspired by the thrill of a roller coaster ride and convinced her uncle to build a makeshift one off of a shed roof in the backyard. This was hard to describe as a success, but she survived with a few scrapes and bruises. Afterwards, she told her sister excitedly, "Oh, Pidge, it's just like flying." Definitely had that mid-Atlantic accent going. So the seeds were planted, right? She's got this adrenaline thing going. Other things she would do as a child included collecting bugs, toads, gross. She was also given a .22 rifle at 9 with her grandparents, very nervous about this. It was a practical gift, and she would hunt rats in the barn, clearing out pests and such. And also, according to her father, he said, quote, "This is really a very small rifle." He's not wrong. It's a small rifle. It's still a rifle, but, in 1909, at age 11 or 12, Amelia began public school in Des Moines, Iowa. Around the same time, she had seen her first airplane. Not the first one she would fly, but just, saw one on display at the Iowa State Fair in 1907. But really wasn't that interested in it. She described it as a thing of rusty wire and wood and ran off to the merry-go-round instead. In a little over a decade, her opinion would change, but the moving portion of her childhood, not over. The Earharts would again move to St. Paul, Minnesota in 1915, and then again to Chicago, where she graduated from Hyde Park High School in 1916. She was not super popular in Chicago. She became kind of recognized as outspoken and very serious. So much so that she organized a petition to fire a teacher because they were lazy, which, as you might expect, backfired on her social life. Did not make her super popular with her peers. Very much a, hey, what about our homework kind of student, which is, annoying for sure, but also looking back on it as an adult, they're told what to do all day, every day, and expecting every single student to play it cool when something they were expected to have finished was not brought up. That's got to be tough. And, she's very bright, had good grades, but, like I said, not super popular. As mentioned before, the various moves were largely due to her father's instability in employment. Thanks to his drinking, Amelia even tried to help in the ways that kids often try to do. She found hidden booze and poured it out, which enraged him to the point of physicality, although her mother stepped in before he actually was able to strike her. It was her mother that caused the move to Chicago, feeling that a stable separation from whatever the heck Edwin was doing would be good for the girls. This move came on the heels of a legal victory for Amelia's mother, who was awarded an appropriate amount of the inheritance that was held from her when her mother had passed away. This time with her mother, I think, impacted her trajectory pretty heavily. Remembering her mother was a big proponent of independence, progressiveness, and also just very intelligent. So when Amelia graduated, she left Chicago, Chi-Town, and enrolled in Ogant's School for Young Ladies in Pennsylvania. She was elected the vice president of her class and was secretary for the local Red Cross chapter. She also helped have discriminatory sorority practices abolished, real leadership stuff. And if you're looking at the timeline, you might be noticing that the year was 1916. The War to End All Wars, Part 1, kicks off, and in that, Amelia was inspired to volunteer in the Red Cross as a more than a secretary. She was visiting with her sister, Pidge, Muriel is her actual name, in Canada, and saw that wounded soldiers were arriving, and this kind of struck a nerve with her. She was a nurse's aide at Spadina Military Hospital, where she would care for wounded soldiers, particularly the heavily injured ones. While enjoying her time off, Amelia attended a flying exhibition at an event, and a stunt plane buzzed the crowd, flew super low, diving at the crowd and then pulling up last second. When the dive happened, people naturally and instinctively scattered, except for Amelia. She would later say that the plane had spoken to her, and this was calling to flight. She had not decided what that calling meant, so until this, she would attend Columbia University in 1919 in a pre-med program to continue to help people. She continued to do well in her classes, but there was just something holding her back. She did not feel a sense of fulfillment that she thought she would. In 1920, Amelia traveled to California hoping that she could reconcile her parents. She was unsuccessful, but the time she spent there, she attended several more air shows and flight demos. On one such occasion, while attending an air show, with her father, Amelia paid $10 to be taken on a 10-minute flight with a veteran pilot named Frank Hawks. Amelia later said that in this moment, as soon as we left the ground, I knew myself I had to fly. Let me know if that impression gets annoying. Immediately, every spared cent she had went straight to savings for flying lessons. She worked as a truck driver, stenographer at a telephone company, photographer's assistant, all sorts of odd jobs just to save money to follow her dream. In January 1921, she began taking lessons from a woman named Anita Snook, who was a pioneer in aviation as well as for women in general. She was also one of the few female pilots at the time. According to Snook, Amelia was a little rough at first, but intensely focused and fearless, but definitely needed refinement, obviously. I mean, she's new. In addition to the odd jobs she worked for money, for lessons, she also resorted to making her own clothes, even creating her own leather flight jacket, which she wore to bed to make it look more seasoned, which is pretty cool, pretty adorable. Halfway through 1921, Amelia purchased her first airplane, a bright yellow Kenner Airster, nicknamed Canary for the color scheme. It's a great starter plane, only 2 seats, 1 engine, nothing crazy. With owning her own plane, she was able to get her solo flight hours up rapidly without the reliance on renting and scheduling times to use other people's planes. She became obsessed, wanting nothing more than to be as good as she could be. Her first major achievement came in October of 1922 when she flew to an altitude of 14,000 feet, which is a world record for female pilots at the time. Word of this confident, independent trailblazer began to spread. The California Aviation Club welcomed her in as part of their typically tight-knit community. In May of 1923, she received her NAA pilot's license, the 16th woman in history to be issued one. This turned her into a bona fide professional aviator and put her amongst an elite and very tiny community in the world. The determination she got to had to go from working all sorts of kind of odd jobs just to pay for lessons, being a licensed pilot in 2 years, super impressive. She also had the tenacity to challenge and break records, something that would obviously continue through her lifetime. She took part in various air shows, exhibition flights, and of course flew for her own excitement, but she was not really earning any money from any of this, not enough to maintain a living anyway. She also had a bad sinus issue, which ultimately kept her from flying for quite a while. While she was away from flying, she did public speaking events, wrote and worked as a social worker in Boston, helping immigrant women and children during her time there. In May of 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic by himself. A major feat increased public interest in aviation, and there were promotional opportunities that could help grow it even further. Capitalizing on this moment, there was an idea to have a woman do the same thing that Lindbergh had just done, fly solo across the Atlantic. Of course, it had been done already, but there's always some aftershock excitement to have it be done by, the next person of a minority group. In April of 1928, a man named George Putnam, a publicist, also his middle name is Palmer, so George Palmer Putnam, the publisher and publicist. Yeah, I can't even say that once. He approached Amelia to get her to be the first woman to be a passenger on a transatlantic flight. Notice I said passenger. She was, known in aviation circles. She could fly, but was not chosen for this ability. She was chosen because he felt she embodied the adventurous modern woman. She was tall, athletic, photogenic, and America was primed to have such a woman become the vision of female aviators. June 17, 1928, Amelia, along with pilot Wilmer Stoltz and mechanic Lewis Gordon, departed Newfoundland and traveled 20 hours and 40 minutes before landing in Wales. She became known as the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air, but she was not satisfied. At this moment, Amelia said that she was, quote, a sack of potatoes on this flight, and clearly spurned by just being an icon without actually doing anything, and I respect that. Despite how she felt when she returned to America, she was a hero. Celebrated with ticker tape parades in New York, invited to the White House to meet President Calvin Coolidge. She published a ghost-written book titled 20 Hours, 40 Minutes, recounting the journey, started doing speaking engagement, lectures, and various endorsements. All of this spearheaded by George Putnam, who had convinced her to do the flight in the first place. George was crafting her public image, posing her to be the symbol of American womanhood, independent, capable, and adventurous. By 1930, Amelia was very much part of the American lexicon. People knew who she was, of course. With any level of fame, there are critics who come out and say she didn't deserve the spotlight. People said that she was nothing more than a symbol, not renowned for her flying abilities. But Amelia did not listen to them. She worked relentlessly to prove herself, wanting to earn status the right way. In her mind, she wanted to go for real records, not just for women, but for everyone. Also in 1930, she began competing in air races. She set a record for women's speed at 181.18 miles per hour in May of that year. She entered various events like the Women's Air Derby, which I assure you is not an airplane version of a demolition derby. She was, with every flight, getting more synonymous with women aviation pioneers, as well as showcasing her tenacity, skill, and resilience. She also assisted in organizing the Women Aviators, which established the 99s in 1929. This was an organization aimed at providing mutual support and promotional opportunities to women in aviation. Amelia herself would be elected as the president in 1931. Every appearance she made, whether speaking, interviewing, was practiced to be modest as possible and give the critics no fuel. George Putnam was making sure Amelia was well prepared and noticed as much as possible. In fact, she was so well noticed by his efforts that his wife said, "Whoa, what's happening here?" Several times before they divorced, and he and Amelia got married in 1931. Scandalous! In April of 1931, Amelia set a new altitude record in women's autogyro at 18,415 feet. And that's super impressive because you could not catch me in an autogyro at 3 feet. These are essentially if a helicopter and an airplane had a baby, no chance. In addition to looking absolutely insane, it was harder to fly. Shocker. This record gave her skills a little bit of a proof to back them up. This also established a trend of experimentation, always up for a challenge of trying new aircraft. This, coinciding with many different mediums that she dipped her toes into at the guidance of George, resulted in many different companies wanting to work with her. She would often write articles for nationally published magazines, endorse various products like luggage companies, clothing, and even cigarettes. By the middle of the 30s, she was one of the most famous women in the nation and recognized outside of it quite often as well. All of this recognition, super nice, but she still had naysayers. She wanted to keep going until she proved them all wrong. This started with rewriting her story. She was the first woman to travel by air across the Atlantic Ocean. She wanted to be the first woman to fly across it solo. In May of 1932, 5 years to the day of Charles Lindbergh's famous flight, she departed the same place they had before, Newfoundland, with the intention of landing in Paris, France, not Texas, in case you were confused. As she flew, she had a lot of challenges. The plane she was flying was a Lockheed Vega 5B, which experienced several mechanical issues. Basically, as soon as she took off, she had to deal with intense headwinds. This is not ideal since the wind would actively resist her forward motion and just trash her fuel mileage, basically. To combat this, Amelia decided to fly higher, but when she would do that, she began to have ice build up on her wings at around 12,000 feet. Also not optimum because it adds weight and extra stress to the wing. She was forced to descend again and endure poor conditions and lower elevation. Her altimeter also malfunctioned, which is good. That's the little mechanism that tells you how high up you are. Not important at all. She was flying blind, no GPS to speak of, no altimeter, and basically no real way of determining where she was outside of a compass. Storms mounted as she flew, various updrafts rocked the plane around, and she had no way to communicate with anyone, nor did she have a parachute or a life raft. She trusted her skills to take her to her destination, which is bold, but, also a little insane. All of the, basically great weather made it impossible to land in Paris, so now she was forced to make an emergency landing. She dipped below the clouds, which is also super scary when you don't have an altimeter, because flying over the ocean in cloudy weather can put you right into the drink if you're not careful. During the descent, she spotted an open field and opted to land there, touching down near Coolmore in Northern Ireland. Over 2,000 miles, 14 hours, 15 minutes. She crossed the Atlantic by herself. On the flight itself, she had this to say: "I've often said that the lure of flying is the lure of beauty, but I was not alone in finding the Atlantic crossing a thing of stern reality and grim trial. I felt myself more alone than any person could ever experience on land, as if I were suspended somewhere far out in space between two worlds." I don't know why I decided to do that voice for her, but that's what it is. She was found by the farmer whose land it was, and he was probably super confused as to what was happening. For her efforts, she was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the first woman to do so, National Geographic Society's Gold Medal given to her by President Herbert Hoover. She was also made an honorary member of the British Royal Aeronautical Society. The fanfare did not stop there either. When she returned to the United States, she began to get even more attention from people wanting her as a speaker for events, endorsements, and books. She published The Fun of It in 1932. She was involved in lecture circuits all across the country. The wife of FDR, Eleanor Roosevelt, befriended her, and she was given a personal flight around D.C. airspace by Amelia. Amelia, a staunch supporter of equality, equal opportunity, not only in aviation but everywhere, often spoke on the importance of women being able to do things for themselves, never getting in political discussions, but often spoke simply on the possibility of women needing to try to do things that men can do. The accomplishments were also still coming in. In January of 1935, Amelia became the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to California. That's right, I said person. She flew over 2,400 miles across the open ocean and did it with very little issues compared to her last ocean crossing. Later that year, she was also the first person to fly solo from Los Angeles to Mexico City, and Mexico City to Newark, New Jersey. And I realized that these things might seem like silly to be the first person to do so, but when the technology of something is still growing into the public eye, you got to keep attention somehow. Around this time, Amelia also partnered with Purdue University. Go Owls. She worked as a consultant for them, also would encourage engineering students of the female persuasion to pursue careers not just in aviation, but any scientific field they may be interested in. All of these ideas and encouragement were well and good, but Amelia had more dreams, more adventures to be had. By 1936, Amelia had decided what her next big thing was. She would steal the Declaration of Independence. No, she wanted to circumnavigate the globe. This has already been done several times, both by air and sea, and she wanted to be the first to do it blindfolded, a daring and challenging thing, especially since I made it up. No, she wanted to travel as close to the equator on this trip as she possibly could. She believed this to be the truest circumnavigation that could be achieved, because that's obviously the widest point of the planet. This would be roughly a 29,000-mile trip. Not only was it a long trip, it would be very expensive. The funding came from a few different sources, mainly Purdue University, who I am being told now are not the Owls, but actually trains. Weird. Anyway, Amelia had been working with the university. They had agreed to be part of the funding. Honestly, not a lot needed to be paid for. The fuel and plane, were the lion's share of it. The plane itself, a Lockheed Electra 10E, specially tailored for this trip. It was called the Flying Laboratory because of all the pieces to record data inside it. It also had a reinforced frame and hull and seating removed except captain and navigator chairs. the freed up space, now designated for extra fuel tanks. In 1937, this cost around $80,000. Nothing to sneeze at for sure. Around $1.7 million today. Then the fuel and oil and all that stuff for a round trip, also not super cheap, including mechanical services, spare parts, and everything. They were looking at upwards of $100,000 of their money. The one thing they were able to spare in expenses for was lodging, but not because they were like camping inside the plane. Granted, the full extent of their sleeping, not to the same level you might expect. It is more like long naps than anything else. Either in their seats or on the floor, or they had like a little tent that they could like prop up on the wing, off of the wing anyway. Yeah, loose pillows here and there. And this was only an issue when they were going to be in very remote areas, like as they crossed Africa and into the Asian islands, right in the near the Pacific. In places with more population around the airstrips, they were able to secure hotels, staying at houses of people offering shelter or government-provided lodging. But have to imagine this wasn't hard to do in places that knew who Amelia was. Her husband, George, also played a part in securing various arrangements thanks to his publicity skills. The pair also had financial incentive to make sure this was successful. While Amelia was popular, that doesn't equate to being wealthy. She had to write books, do speaking engagements, and things like that to keep a steady income. And she was not the sole breadwinner, but, they had to keep earning if she wanted to keep flying. There's also the issue of the country being on the back end of the Great Depression, which slowed the attendance to her speeches quite a bit. George was very nervous about the trip, feeling it could be very dangerous, but also supported her and agreed to handle as much of the logistics and media bits as he could. Then you have the trailblazing nature of Amelia, where she wanted to do whatever it took to inspire more women to pursue careers or activities dominated by men. Immense pressure on many sides of this event, but she was sure she could do it. The plans for this trip originally consisted of a route that went from east to west, from the U.S. to Hawaii, Hawaii to the Howland Island, and then through the islands in the southeast Pacific towards Australia, up to India, and around through Africa, basically. This was actually changed after an unfortunate crash occurred on takeoff from Hawaii that not only changed the voyage altogether, but also put a delay on the trip. Stories are mixed up of what actually occurred, but what is known is that shortly after takeoff, during takeoff, actually, the plane experienced what is known as ground loop. This is a sharp swerve that resulted in landing gear, undercarriage, and propellers being damaged in the process. This also cost a lot of money, some $20,000 in repairs. A contemporary of Amelia's and certified hater, Major Al Williams, said, quote, "That ship got away from her, and that's the lowdown." That feels like how he would have sounded. Witnesses and Amelia herself stated that the tire blew or something happened with the landing gear. Others say she struggled to maintain the plane on takeoff. There might be some credence to what Williams says, and, he's not just any type of hater. He's a very decorated pilot, Marine Corps officer. He was a stunt pilot, raced planes, all the things. And while I did call him a hater a moment ago, this is not an instant in which I'm referring to. I'll share that in a little bit. According to Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last, written by Mike Campbell, Williams wrote in a Cleveland newspaper that I quoted, a moment ago. In that same book, another man states that he was told by Harry Manning, who was in the co-pilot's chair at the time, that Amelia was jockeying the throttle on takeoff, and she tried to do too much and it got away from her. If this is true, although a lot of the statements made in that book are secondhand, so if we look at that statement and the statement made by Al Williams, then it could be. I mean, I'm going to add my own personal experience here that I have been, like I said, been flying her flight via Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I told you about my struggles with her airplane taking off. And that plane of hers, every time it would veer. And so her plane, the Electra, 2 front landing gear and then 1 tail wheel in the back. And as you get to a certain speed, the tail lifts up because you're beginning to lift off the ground. So the front 2 wheels are on the ground, the back one is not. And the only way to control it is via your ailerons or your horizontal flaps on the back and the rudders. So you have to manage to prevent this thing from turning. And a lot of the issues that you deal with is what's called prop wash, which is basically turbulence created on the back side of the propellers that can throw off the way the plane lifts and takes off. So maybe that's what, maybe I'm just bad at flying that plane. I don't know. But here's the thing, is on the other versions, I can take off just fine. I took off and landed in the other Lockheed 10, not the more modern one, but the regular one. So I don't know what the deal is. Anyway, Williams was more harsh and less nuanced on his thought process of the entire voyage. He stated that he believed it to be nothing more than a publicity stunt aimed at padding her pockets. And I think this is kind of a whack stance to take because, you know, isn't that kind of like every trip after the first one in a new vehicle? Like, at a certain point, every subsequent iteration of a trip is done to gain something. Maybe I've read too many philosophical books or listened to too much Pink Floyd, but there's rarely just a true, authentic, unselfish reason to do anything. Even, you know, simple things like holding the door for somebody makes you feel like a good person. Doesn't mean you are one. You did it to satisfy that internal need of recognition. The flights that Amelia did, yes, she was trying to break barriers, open the door wide open for women in male jobs. Yes, she was successful at becoming a pilot despite the lack of training and abilities to become one that men had much easier access to. She still had bills to pay and still had to make a living. She was lucky in the way that she was able to pursue financial success to live her life by doing something she was passionate about. Not many get to say that. So was this a stunt by her? Sure. Was it worse than any other person trying to one-up the Wright brothers? I don't really think so. And also, Major Al Williams was he raced planes. That's stunt flying. I don't know. It's, I appreciated that she was willing to go the extra length, not just to circle the globe, but to go to the widest part possible. That's, especially cool to me. Major Al Williams, he hated her plane also. He despised that they called it the Flying Laboratory, stating that it wasn't carrying anything other than long distance, any other long distance plane had at the time. And while this is mostly accurate, the plane was not a laboratory in the true sense of the word. It was a metaphorical lab that was, it's pushing boundaries of what people saw as possible. It did have different instruments to help gather data, and these could have been placed on any other aircraft, but they had put a lot of them on Amelia's because it was a good way to market it, in a sense. And that brings me back to the publicity comment. What exactly is wrong with being a stunt flight? Are those somehow less involved, skillful, or valid? Of course it's a publicity stunt. But like I said, so is racing, Mr. Williams. Is that not a publicity stunt to try and be the fastest person in a plane to do a certain route? Almost like she was going to be the person to be the fastest to circumnavigate the Earth along the most challenging route ever attempted, right? Wasn't Charles Lindbergh's New York to Paris flight also a stunt? It was done for a prize, it was done for fame, but nobody said Lindbergh didn't deserve respect because of it. I mean, maybe the guy that stole his baby. The same rules should apply here. Amelia wasn't hiding the risks or pretending this flight was something it wasn't. She knew it was ambitious, dangerous, and yes, history-making. That's what pioneers do. Whether you're chasing a trophy or a headline or the horizon, the courage it takes is still pretty real. Got in the weeds about that, my bad. Back to the preparations. I mentioned the Electra. Hers was left in a stainless finish with red being painted on the front of the wings. I don't know if there's a specific reason for this, but, maybe it's like a corrosion prevention. I don't know. Her plane was also given the number NR16020. Also, fun fact, only 149 of these planes were ever made. And the second most famous one is in the movie Casablanca. So, yeah, anyway, plane is ready to go. On to the crew. How was Fred Noonan chosen to be a navigator? Who is he? Why does he get left out of pretty much every conversation about this doomed trip? Because he's the Hat Man. No, of course not. Fred Noonan was born in 1893 in Illinois. He was a merchant sailor, became a licensed ship navigator, master of celestial navigation, which is the use of elements outside of our planet to navigate and determine location. By the 1920s, Fred had begun training in aviation navigation as the popularity and possibility of flight grew. The 1930s, he was a hot shot in the air navigation field, especially in long-distance flights and overwater navigation. He was hired by a company we discussed before in the episode, and then, the Pan America Airways. He charted tons of routes for them, being a major contributor to their Clipper routes that connected California to China by way of Hawaii, Midway Island, Wake Island, and Guam. By the time he was chosen, he had logged thousands of hours of navigation across open water for using tools that have been used for hundreds of years, sextants, compasses, and even what is known as dead reckoning. Dead reckoning is much less scarier than the name sounds. Simply using the speed at which you're going, combined with a fixed spot and set direction to calculate your current position. Obviously. In other words, if you know how fast you're moving, what direction you're heading, and where you started, you can make a pretty good estimate of where you are without needing to see landmarks or receive radio signals, although those are super helpful and prevent errors from building up over long flights. George Putnam and Amelia both agreed they needed someone with the right kind of moxie to get her through the Pacific leg of the journey. As we have learned on several occasions, the Pacific Ocean is a fickle mistress and is not to be trifled with. His experience was very valuable, and as luck would have it, he recently left Pan Am. He was also initially only supposed to be part of the Pacific section, but after the failed first attempt, they revised to keep him on the entire route. Some contemporary concerns of Fred was that he had a bit of a drinking problem. Some even suspect that this might have something to do with their fate, but also there's millions of things that might have had to do with it, so who's to say? On the positive side of contemporary accounts, one Pan Am pilot said this of Noonan, quote, "Fred could find a postage stamp in the Pacific if he had a sextant and the time to read the stars," which is pretty high praise. I can dig it, man. I also wonder how much of his drinking was obvious to Amelia, if it was true, right? Since she had a history with her father being an alcoholic and all. Anyway. Among other things to note for the trip, the plane would have been outfitted with radio equipment. We discussed the evolution of radio a few episodes back, the pirate radio episode. The advent of radio, obviously super helpful for travel across the seas, but as aviation became more and more long distance, there was a benefit to having it on planes as well. This started small with basic Morse code transmissions where pilots would tap signals back to the ground. As radio technology advanced, long wave and medium wave frequencies become more commonplace in aviation, but there were problems. Planes had to rely on bouncing signals off the Earth's atmosphere, particularly the ionosphere, which worked, but also meant the signals could be distorted, delayed, or weakened, especially over long distances or in bad weather. Instead of getting a clean, direct line, pilots often picked up multiple overlapping signals or ghost signals bouncing around unpredictably. It made locking onto a signal, guiding signal, challenging, especially when trying to find something as tiny as an island in the middle of the Pacific. And there was another issue. Amelia, the trailblazer that she was not exactly the most tech-savvy. Sure. Are you saying sir or sure? Sure, she could turn knobs and levers with the best of them, but understanding radio frequencies at basically its infancy was a whole other issue. I think had she been born maybe 5 to 10 years later, she probably could have figured it out a lot easier, but she was, she was not the only one learning about it, and even the people who had been using it frequently were still learning new things about it all the time. That said, her struggles with radio weren't just common, they were consequential. For starters, Amelia never became proficient in Morse code, which was still the primary backup communication method for long-distance flights. She preferred voice transmissions, which were convenient but far less reliable, especially over open ocean. This wasn't a minor oversight. It meant she couldn't receive or reply to coded messages when voice communication failed. She also had a direction-finding receiver installed on the Electra, theoretically a tool that could help her lock on to radio beacons and navigate more accurately. But by multiple accounts, including from radio technicians who worked with her, she didn't fully understand how to use it. There are even reports that she missed some of the training sessions on how it worked or didn't seem particularly concerned with the technical side of the equipment. That overconfidence or perhaps just prioritization of the mission elements came back to haunt her, right? Right before the final leg from Lay to Howland, she reportedly failed to test transmission with the ground radio operators, unable to receive a test signal that would have helped her calibrate for the most dangerous part of the journey. Then there's the frequency confusion. Amelia and the Coast Guard cutter Itasca weren't on the same page. Literally, they were using different frequencies for transmission and reception, and neither side seemed entirely clear on what the plan was. Worse yet, Amelia tried to use a frequency direction finding that the Itasca wasn't equipped to transmit on, and her own direction finding gear may have been broken or undertested or just misused. And it wasn't all on her. 1930s aviation technology was notoriously finicky. Malfunctions super common. Even experienced military pilots had troubles with it. But Amelia's radio-related issues weren't just a product of faulty gear. They stemmed from this disconnect between the rapid pace of emerging aviation technology and limited time pilots had to master all of it. After her disappearance, some critics, like Major Al Williams, were harsh, saying she was, a stunt flyer out of her depth. Others defended her fiercely, pointing out that she was doing what many others wouldn't do or wouldn't dare to do, which is fair. Still, it's hard to escape the reality that radio missteps were one of the biggest contributors to the tragedy that followed. And it is kind of interesting to me that she did not have a navigator who was also a skilled radio operator. But either way, we are now to the final voyage. Their plans, as I mentioned, shifted from a westward trip from Hawaii to Howland and so on. You might be curious as to what was so special about Howland Island, since you've probably never heard of it or only heard of it in regards to Amelia. Well, Howland Island was not chosen because it has this scenic, majestic view. It's not a tourist location like Hawaii. It has no residents. The island is less than 2 miles in length. There's over 3 acres total land. So why there? Well, because she said so. That's why. No, it was actually a little bit bigger than Amelia on this end. While this uninhabited slab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean did provide a good stopping point for Amelia and Fred between Hawaii and New Guinea, there were definitely other larger options. The bigger part is that the United States government had just picked Howland as a place to develop an airstrip and potentially a hangar, a strategic point in the Pacific, as the American military had been observing the Japanese advancement leading up to World War II. The U.S. started to prepare the land for such a project a few years prior to Earhart's flight, and her landing on it would provide much-needed proof of its usefulness. Okay, so May 20th, 1937, Amelia Earhart, Fred Noonan depart Oakland, California, travel to Tucson, then to New Orleans, and lastly Miami on the continental U.S. part of their journey. This was around 2,500 miles total. Nothing major to note. She was at each stop talked to by reporters who said that she was more upbeat but also determined, purposeful. They arrived in Miami on the 25th of May and stayed until June 1st. Give maintenance crews just enough time for one final once-over and tweakage. They had to fix a window, big important things. There would be maintenance crews available at some of the other stops, but it was going to be, few and far between. After they left the U.S., Amelia's husband, George Putnam, spoke in an interview around this time in response to some who called this a publicity stunt. He said, quote, "This is not about showing off. It's a scientific pioneering endeavor, and I stand behind Amelia every step of the way." I would hope so. It'd be super weird if her husband and publicist was like, "Oh, yeah, did not think she was serious. She snuck out of the house, took the keys to the plane, and off she went. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt had this to say about the trip, quote, Amelia Earhart shows us what courage looks like. She represents the independence and potential of women everywhere. In Miami, Amelia went over the plans with Fred, making sure there was no two ways about what they were doing, where they were going. Maintenance crews checked over the plane, rechecked some of the radio equipment, even if there was still confusion. Fueled up. Also decided to leave their parachutes or their life raft here in Miami. Eventually, they would get rid of their parachutes too, which feels weird, but they were trying to save weight as much as they could. Amelia wrote a final letter to George in Miami, ensuring him of her commitment to the journey. The letter in full is as follows. Please know I am quite aware of the hazards of the trip. I want to do it because I want to do it. Women must try and do things as men have tried. And when they fail, their failures must be but a challenge to others. She was all in. I respect the heck out of that attitude. June 1st, they departed Miami and headed to San Juan, Puerto Rico. This was around 1,000 miles, and when they departed, the trip was starting to gain some traction in the press. Before leaving Miami, Amelia gave a mini speech to the reporters and said, We are finally on our way. This time, I hope, around the world. June 2nd, they flew to Carapito, Venezuela. This section was around 6 hours of flying for 611 miles, give or take. They landed at an airfield which was in use by Pan Am and Standard Oil. Apparently had excellent facilities. And, I mentioned that, in my replication of this flight via Flight Simulator, this airfield no longer exists. And then I went to look it up because I wanted to land there because I wanted to be as accurate as possible. And it's not there. So I Googled it, tried to figure it out, and there's like a travel pin there on Google Maps, and then there's reviews. And people are talking about how locals had no idea who Amelia Earhart was, why this plot of land had any significance, and also apparently they had been using it as a racetrack, which is understandable. It just kind of cracked me up because people in the United States have this weird sense of entitlement when it comes to landmarks in other countries. Anyway, I wanted to share that. Onward we go. From Carapito, they flew to Dutch Guyana, Paramaribo, to be specific. Another 610-ish mile flight. Pretty tame, but a little rainy at first. Flew around 5,000 feet in elevation for this section. Amelia ecstatic to see the plush jungles of South America and snaking rivers. After staying in Paramaribo overnight, hosted by Dutch officials, they departed around 6 a.m. on the 4th of June, flying to Fortaleza Airport in Brazil. This is around 1,300 miles and took 10 hours. 970-ish miles were over the jungle, and then the remainder over the Atlantic. And Earhart remarked that during the flight that the Brazilian coast from the air is beautiful but lonely. Long green and edged with endless surf. She sounds like she needs to be in like Gone with the Wind or something. I'm not sure that voice is working, but it's cracking me up, so I'm going to keep doing it. She was also impressed with the facilities at Fortaleza, and they, made the next day, the 5th of June, a crew rest day. In terms of rest, they were still working. They had various preparations and things to think about. The departure and destinations were fixed, kind of. They had, room for adjustment, but depending on the weather, both rain and wind, that could change what route they end up taking and what elevation they needed to be at. Maintenance crews inspected the Electra here, fueled and serviced. The next day, short flight from Fortaleza to Natal, Brazil, around 267 miles. And this was a flight to get to the furthest possible spot of South America to prepare for the voyage across the Atlantic in full. She wanted to get every possible bit of leverage on her side to cross the Atlantic. They even fixed the plane at eastbound takeoff before resting for the evening. She had planned on potentially flying the Atlantic that same day since they departed before 5 a.m. and landed before 7, but ultimately decided to push it to give themselves some rest for the long haul the next day. They departed at 3:15 in the morning, before dawn even, and they took off from a grass runway to avoid crosswinds. The journey from Natal to St. Louis, Senegal, I'm assuming it's Saint Louis, Senegal, was around 1,960 miles, took 13 hours to complete. They encountered some thunderstorms, rain, thick clouds, which hindered navigation. Noonan had to use dead reckoning to determine position. The haze and some slight navigational errors actually landed them in the wrong place. They were meant to go to Dakar, but instead landed in St. Louis. The pair credited their missed navigation to the worst weather they had experienced flying over the ocean. June 8th, they corrected their mistake flying from St. Louis to Dakar. There was a welcoming party. The plane was tended to after their cross-ocean trek. Engines needed a little bit of a tune-up, and the pair stayed the night in Dakar. And the next day was also no-fly day, so that they could study for the newest weather reports for the trip across the Sahara. Flying over the Sahara, not super popular at the time. Obviously, it's one of the most harsh deserts in the world due to that fact, very little in terms of emergency landing options. Not only that, but this stretch was going to test the plane and crew in terms of wind and heat. Amelia stated, quote, "The Sahara is an The Sahara is an ocean of a different kind, less forgiving in some ways." June 10th, the pair departed Dakar and flew to Gao, French Sudan. This flight was around 1,000 miles, took around 8 hours to complete. They decided on Gao as a last-minute alternate due to storms in their original intended stop of Nami. The pair landed in Gao with a reception from French officials who gave them places to sleep overnight. Earhart described their journey over the desert as utterly flat, arid, and uninhabited, which checks out. After staying overnight, they departed to Chad, a 9-hour, 910-mile journey. Before they left, they were given a marvelous breakfast by the French, an omelette du fromage, and some hot cocoa. Not exactly the kind of beverage I would like while I was in the Sahara before air conditioning, but it's the thought that counts, right? The trip to Chad was also mind-boggling to Amelia. As they flew over the vast desert, she found it incomprehensible in condition, an eternal no-man's land of barren desert. She expressed relief when they landed in Chad, which makes sense. I know it's not the same, but I've driven through the salt flats in Utah, right? Boy, howdy, was I ready to end that. Just show me some kind of color. It's just so bright and boring. I can only imagine being in a plane where your view changes on a scale hard to see from 10,000 feet for 10 hours. They departed Chad and flew a balmy 1,100 miles to Khartoum, Sudan. They made a stop a quarter of the way through, had a leak in landing gear strut that delayed their departure in Chad. Heat must have been getting to her because they stayed the night in Al-Fashir in Sudan before continuing to Khartoum the next day. Amelia also noted that the heat was more than 100 degrees in the shade, which is, not fun at all. Combine that with being in a tin can flying in the bright sun. I'm sure it's not, I'm sure it was very hot. They actually had concerns of mental fatigue, which is stress on the metal structures due to high heat. Fred had described this flight to journalists when they landed. "We traveled through the air so hot it felt like flying through a kiln." Yeah, you know what? I'm telling you, I'm pretty sure I'm nailing these voices. On the 13th of June, they departed Al-Fashir to Khartoum, arriving in 3 hours. Once they landed, British officials there had told them to pay a fee for landing, so they refueled and then continued to Massawa in the afternoon. During this day, Amelia described having seen the Nile River corridor for the first time. She said it was like a thin green lifeline across an endless brown sheet. The flight to Massawa was a respite. Massawa is a major port in the Red Sea. It was still very hot there, but, the crew needed a rest, so they stayed the night. The next day, they took a short flight to Assab, another city in Eritrea. This was a 250-mile flight and chosen due to its better facilities and larger supplies of fuel. There's plenty of attention as the pair had been asked to be in several photographs, and locals even wanted to come take photos with the plane while Amelia and Fred worked on it. June 15th, they leave Assab and fly to Karachi, India, which is now in Pakistan. This was a big trip, 1880 miles, 13 hours, record-setting nonstop flight from Red Sea to Indian subcontinent. Pretty cool. After the long seaway flight, the Electra was inspected, and they stayed the night there, and the next day as well. Fully serviced the plane, Earhart herself going through anything she could, like a want list to be done, They departed Karachi for Calcutta, India on June 17th. That's 1,400 miles in around 8 hours. They noted there was a Dust Bowl type storm going on below them, which obscured ground, but they still managed to navigate just fine. They landed at Dum Dum Airport around 4 p.m. local time, and British officials and onlookers welcomed them. The next day, they left at 6 a.m. for Akia, Burma. They had to take off from a mud-soaked runway thanks to some storms in the afternoon prior. This was dangerous, but it was better than the alternative of waiting for them to rework the runway, which could take days. They barely cleared the trees at the edge of the airfield. They flew for 400 miles, landing in Akyab, and just 3.5 hours later, they refueled and took off for Rangoon, but had to return due to monsoon conditions. June 19th, they successfully landed in Rangoon, Burma, modern-day Myanmar. The trip itself only taking 3 hours to cover less than 300 miles. Earhart was impressed by the Mingaladan aerodrome in Rangoon. It was, and they were received well by the British and native Burmese, due to the flight being some public, like the public being excited to hear for it, to see them land after the day prior. June 20th, they flew from Rangoon to Bangkok, Thailand in a 300-mile trip. Flight was not unpleasant as the days prior. Worst they had on this stretch was some wind as they flew through a mountain range between Burma and Siam. Once on the other side, things cleared and there were endless lengths of jungle and rice paddies below. She noticed how if they had to, there was no emergency location that would, tear the plane apart upon landing. The jungle is magnificent carpet until it's your only landing option. They quickly refueled and departed Bangkok to Singapore. Love Singapore. This was a 900-ish mile flight, taking them around 6 hours. They arrived in Singapore, having left Rangoon just after another airline, but they had arrived before that airline, so that's pretty cool. They took a more direct route. Singapore had just opened their airport 8 days prior to their arrival, and once her and Fred landed, they put the Electra in a hangar, and the pair stayed overnight with the American consulate, who provided sleeping arrangements and dinner and such. First thing in the morning on June 21st, they departed. They flew 550 miles to Bandung. This is in modern-day Indonesia. When they arrived, a little bit of a problem. Amelia made a respectful faux pas. She dissed Terry. No, hold on. I read that wrong. She fell ill with dysentery. Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. She was ordered to rest as dysentery. Not exactly something you want to do anything with, let alone fly an airplane over crazy, harsh environments. She and Noonan were grounded for the next few days, partly due to her illness and then also because of the weather. Good news is that it gave them plenty of time to make sure the monsoons and other major weather events they flew through didn't damage the aircraft. They were back in the air on June 25th, flying to Java, a 300-mile flight, but upon landing there, they noticed some things that needed to be repaired, and so they flew back to Bandung. They tried again the next day. Amelia had also recovered a little bit more and landed in Surabaya, Java, around 310 miles under 3 hours. There's some accounts also here that Noonan was drinking again. I mentioned it before, but some of his contemporaries stated that he was drinking, but also there's also some counters to that of like how quickly they were getting ready in the morning and how he was navigating, like the skills he was navigating in certain spots kind of made it seem impossible that he was over drinking. He might have had like a couple drinks to go to sleep or something, but Anyway, Amelia was also reported to have said this to mechanics in Java: "I don't like relying on radio. I can't understand it." On the 27th, they were back off, this time to Timor, which is in modern-day Indonesia. They flew for around 670 miles in around 5 hours. Amelia noted the monsoon season was still present, but it was lessening, which is, good. Upon arrival, Dutch officials greeted her. The plane was checked over once again, specifically the direction finder radio equipment. Got the plane fueled up, had some lunch, and took off for Australia. 500 miles from Timor to Darwin, Australia, in 3 hours. When they arrived, the press was anxiously awaiting them. They had the plane repaired further, along with any minor issues that they had found. A local paper had discussed her arrival, stating, "A slender woman," it's Australian, "a slender woman with a windswept hair stepped down like a visiting dignitary of the skies." I don't know. I lost it at the end there. There's too many accents for me to try to do. They also made any changes to their planned route that they needed to, found some ways to lighten the plane further, and this is where they ditched their parachutes, apparently. Noonan is quoted as stating, "We travel light. Weight is fuel. Fuel is life." Kind of similar to the Dyatlov Pass group, right? Light packs because everything else will just burn energy. They also had an antenna removed. The trailing antenna had been taken off due to reduced drag, or taken off to reduce the drag, really trying to squeeze every ounce of fuel they possibly could. They intended on utilizing the fixed direction finding loop for their navigation, the remainder of the journey, along with radio communication with the Itasca, which was anchored near Howland Island. Noonan had said much of the importance of that: "We'll be depending heavily on radio bearings. If the Itasca can't hear us, we're going to have a time of it." June 29th, they fly from Darwin, Australia to Lae, New Guinea, leaving Australia's pivotal moment because they had now departed the last major city of their journey, right? Every place marked after Australia would have smaller infrastructure, if any, less support, harder emergency landing options, less access to immediate public needs. Upon arriving in Lae, they would now just be 2 stops away from the accomplishment of a lifetime. Final stretch, by the time they arrived, they had flown over 20,000 miles, around 161 flight hours. They landed in the afternoon on the 29th. There are photos of her with the Electra. They had both been pleased with the performance of the plane, but the engines needed some tweaks here and there. They were excited to almost be done, but, still wanted to be very cautious. Earhart and Noonan were hosted by the administrators of Guinea Airways, as well as the colonial officers. They stayed the next day as well, dedicating the entire day to planning and overhauling the plane as much as they could. They fueled the Electra with over 1,000 gallons, which is crazy. That's a lot of fuel. Replaced, changed the oil, checked the aircraft, with heavy focus. They went over all of the instruments, the engines, the radio transmitter, receiver, sent out telegrams to U.S. and also to the crew on the Howland Island, giving them updated plans. They actually made plans to leave on July 1st, but they deemed it too risky navigationally to do so. The plane now weighed at a lofty 15,000 pounds, which is close to the operational ceiling that the Electra could handle. A Guinea Airways ground technician stated she was concerned about the weight, but confident it would fly. We all were. I mentioned they were trying to hone in the radio during this stop. Some of the issues that plagued the flight were simple. Radio operator at Lae noticed the frequencies Amelia had given them for the radio seemed off, and, kind of talked about it a little bit, sparing a lot of the technical mumbo-jumbo. Amelia's lack of understanding of the radio frequencies led to her giving out incorrect numbers for the different types of radio technology. Essentially, she got frequencies mixed up. She told the people to communicate with her, she'd be ready to receive them on 7,500 kilowatts or kilocycles, when her transmitter could only go to 900 kilocycles. So potentially she meant 750 kilocycles. I don't know. She also had the damaged antenna that could have received more signal, and they elected to have it removed altogether. So while the Itasca was sending out signals to her for her to follow, she could not tune in to any wavelength. They had tried to coordinate with the Itasca one last time, but were unsuccessful in this. The Itasca was aware of the confusing radio frequencies, not in terms like they knew the mix-up, but that they knew that the numbers didn't quite add up to what they were saying they could do. Now, what they chose to do about it, that's kind of up to them. Maybe they believe that the fancy equipment this flying laboratory was supposed to have, could transmit in those signals. Obviously, they could transmit, but they had a lot more infrastructure to support that. They could have also just believed that, such a tremendous undertaking ahead that Earhart and Noonan would have figured out their mix-up before they got too far along. Amelia did send a cable transmission to George stating, "Radio misunderstanding and personnel unfitness probably will hold one day. Have asked Black to hold one day." Black being Richard Black, who was overseeing Howland Island's receivers. July 2nd at 10 a.m., the Electra took off for the last time. The crew and Lay noticed the plane barely cleared the end of the runway with how heavy with fuel it was. Adding to this was the field was damp and also a grass field. There were also signs that a headwind was mounting, which is not a good sign if you're trying to squeeze every last drop of fuel to make it to your very tiny destination. The distance was 2,556 miles over basically open ocean. No room for error. The Itasca was anchored around 20-ish miles or less than 20-ish miles from Howland Island. They were to provide both voice and Morse communication. They had a constant Morse beep that was to be used as a homing signal. If the signal got fuzzy, they were going the wrong way. If it was strong, that was the right direction, so on. The ship was also to send out smoke signals for the plane, as well as rescue if need be. This flight was going to take anywhere from 18 to 20 hours. The ship received no communication from Earhart until 5 a.m. the next day. She was supposed to check in hourly, and she never did or acknowledge their regular messages. At 5:12 a.m., a weak signal was heard. Dipped into her voice a little too soon there. A weak signal was heard. KHAQQ, calling Itasca. We are approximately 200 miles out, approximately on schedule. The ship responded, but again, she gave no response. The assumption is they had the dial set wrong or it was damaged, so she couldn't hear the ship, and that's why she never responded. An hour later, at 6:14 a.m., another signal came through, stronger than the last. KHAQQ, calling Itasca. We are about 100 miles out. Still no reply from Earhart when the ship responds. The clarity of the signal indicated that she was, in fact, getting closer, though. 7:42 a.m., the infamous transmission from Earhart is received. We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low. Their estimates were she was within 100 miles of the island, but with cloud coverage and poor visibility, the smoke signals that they put up weren't going to help either. 8:43 a.m., the last confirmed transmission from Earhart comes through. We are on the line of 157.337. We are running north and south. Amelia was attempting to take navigational line north and south to search for the island, as it should be there. Noonan, despite his stellar record as a navigator, was held back by their poor visibility. He could have used dead reckoning, but had he done that, it could have just ended just as bad. Dead reckoning, super helpful, but over a long period of distances, the errors, however minute, start to stack up. The Itasca was unable to locate by RDF tracking because she wasn't transmitting on the proper frequency. For them to home in on her signal, 30 minutes after the last signal, the Itasca began search. Planes from Howland flew low over the ocean in grid patterns, trying to locate any signs of a wreck, oil slick, wreckage, distressed flares, or anything else. Lay had reported they last heard Earhart a few hours after she had departed. The U.S. Navy quickly jumped in to help with various ships brought to Central Pacific. They combed a 250,000 square mile area, but they had called the search off after 16 days. The Itasca's chief radio operator, Lee Bellar, stated that they were close. We knew they were close. and they passed us like ghosts in the morning fog. We just couldn't reach each other. And that's both depressing and beautifully said. Witnesses aboard the Itasca state that the last transmission sounded like she was sending it from directly above them with how loud and clear it was. So what happened? No clue. See you next time. No. Theories about what happened range from mundane to movie-worthy. Most likely in my mind, the crash and sink theory, or, crash near an island and, whatever. Yeah, all of the signs were hidden by the ever-changing waters of the ocean. Seems like the good luck that she had finally ran out. She was not taking radio technology seriously enough, and that was a fatal flaw in my opinion. Noonan, unable to get a good read on their location because of poor visibility, and had they had proper radio equipment, he could have calibrated a chronometer inlay. Things might have been differently. I think they are lucky enough to have had any contact with the Itasca at all. Nobody on Howland nor the Itasca ever even saw the plane, despite the proximity and clarity of the transmission they had received. They were tired, they were covered in clouds, and adding in radio issues, there's little chance it could go well. There are other theories, of course. This next one points to the pair landing on Nikamaroro. This island is 350 miles southeast of Howland. In 1937, British colonial officers found radio parts, a woman's shoe, and bones, though the bones were lost in the 1940s. There were also local legends of a man and woman castaways living on the island for a short time. Radio operators in the Pacific logged dozens of super faint transmissions alleging to be from Earhart. Many people chalk this up to people trying to eke out fame from the disappearance, but some credible radio operators reported it as well. The U.S. Navy did a flyover of the island on July 9th, but were unable to find any type of sign of anybody being there, so especially like an airplane. Skeptics point out that they could have been hiding in the trees or something, but, if you were a stranded pilot, one of the first things you'd do is make an indicator or sign that people could locate you, whether it's just some kind of like very man-made rock formation on the beach or something. You're going to try and make it obvious that somebody's there, in my opinion. I don't know. The next one is the theory from one of the books I got a lot of the information with I talked about earlier. And I will say that the introduction to this book makes me think twice about the theory, just because it's so aggressive in tone about how this is a major government cover-up, and that's how it sounded. And those types of books tend to always sound that way. But anyway, this theory, the Saipan theory or Japanese capture theory, points to the pair straying northwest on their path, landing or crash landing on or near an island near Saipan, or on Saipan itself. Following this, the Japanese captured her and Noonan, took the plane out of the water or whatever. According to this theory, they viewed Amelia and Fred as American spies. They were subsequently arrested and possibly tortured and killed. Civilians from Saipan claim to have seen a tall white woman and man who were captured. There are some testimonies that come from various soldiers and Marines who were on the island during and following the war in the Pacific. But there's never been any hard proof of this. It's all just he said, she said. A bigger problem is that the Japanese offered to help to look for her, which is usually a good sign, but then again, they were pretty sneaky back then. One story from the book I read was that there were some interesting looking people on the island that, they were preventing others from going towards a lone hangar. This person had witnessed a group of soldiers yelling that they knew Amelia's plane was in the hangar. A bureaucratic type man was seen on the island as well, a man who was potentially James Forrestal. He was the Secretary of the Navy during the war, then the first Secretary of Defense following the war. He and President Truman did not see eye to eye and was forced to resign in 1949, after which his mental health spiraled out of control and ultimately he was committed to a hospital for depression, and then died in an alleged suicide after falling 16 floors. Added alleged in there because, this whole theory hinges on the fact that he just couldn't live with the fact that he was hiding up the truth of Amelia and Fred's, fate. And that the reason why they were covering it up was to maintain diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Japan following the war. But I gotta tell you, I don't think people would have cared if they knew that Japan had them. You know what I mean? Like, we were still very hostile towards Japan after the war. So I don't know why this theory is acting like, well, we just wanted to be friends with them again. We just nuked them twice. Like, I don't think they care. Another theory of that kind of ties to this is a double life spy theory. This one says that Amelia was on a secret mission for the government to spy on Japan and their military buildup was, and then was captured or rescued and hidden or assumed a new identity. Main thought process was similar to this quote that is from an aviation magazine in the 60s. If she had crashed, we'd have found something. But if she were on a mission, that's a whole different story. How does that make sense? Did this person just forget how vast the ocean is? Like, there's even claims that her new identity was that of Irene Bolam, who, this was debunked heavily, even in court. In any instance, she and Fred disappeared. FDR issued the most expensive air sea search in history at the time to find her. George Putnam, her husband, continued searching even after the Navy had stopped. He had stated, quote, shortly after the disappearance, quote, the ocean is big and she was small. It's as simple and tragic as that. So, kind of a not good lookout on that. Throughout the years, more evidence has been found, though more confusion has also stirred. The International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIGAR, started to search Nikumaroro Island, as they believed this was the most likely of places. They found bones, but they were identified as male and then lost, as mentioned prior. They didn't find those bones, but that's what was found. And then the group itself searched the island, and they found a compact mirror that was made in the United States from the 1930s. All right, a woman's shoe heel, which chemically matched to Earhart's known footwear, and pieces of aircraft aluminum consistent with the Electra, though none of this is conclusive. The bones, despite being lost, did help a little bit. In 2018, an anthropologist from the University of Tennessee used some modern forensic methods to analyze the initial measurements taken of the bones back in 1940. Dr. Richard Jantz said that the measurements of them were consistent with Earhart to a 99% degree higher than any other samples, though without the actual bones, impossible to know for sure. Most evidence points to the Nikumaroro Island theory, though it's hard to tell if they crashed, landed near that island, or if things they found merely floated to the shore thanks to the waves, right? There's been some deep sea sonar type imaging done to the area also, with one promising lead last year, but it turned out to be just a natural rock formation. Another lead on Nikumaroro Island is called the Taraya object. This is an anomaly located on the Taraya Peninsula of Nikumaroro, noted for its sharp angles and straight lines. Dr. Pettigrew of TIGAR believes this to be pieces of the Electra. He had paid for a series of satellite images that spanned, 15 years, I think, and saw that the object just off the shore of the lagoon became most visible after a tropic storm passed through in 2015, and then appeared to be reburied with sediment and sand over the next 9 years. So there's a current funding operation going on if you want to donate to that. He has hopes to travel to the island in August of this year and figure out what that object is. The object has eluded searchers of the island previously due to the fact that it had been partially covered by sediment and also below the surface of the water, combination that hinders even the best researchers. So, maybe we will know by the end of the year. That would be cool. If we do, what happened to it? Well, this island actually has a population of aggressive crabs. Not even kidding. They bite and they're mean. As to the mystery of her fate, we may never know. What we do know is that her legacy has endured. her disappearance is only part of her story. A compelling part, yes, but I don't believe it's the defining moment. What draws people in isn't just the unsolved ending, it's everything she did before that moment. And it was a lot. Amelia Earhart was truly incredible, not because she vanished, but because she refused to be invisible in the first place. She challenged gender norms and took the road, or sky, less traveled, and succeeded in nearly every way imaginable. Her name is still synonymous with courage, rebellion, and purpose. She's not remembered with pity, she's remembered with admiration, with inspiration, and she's been everywhere since. Her childhood home in Atchison, Kansas, now a museum. The 99s, that aviation organization she helped found, still going strong today. She's been subjects of books and biographies, documentaries, and yes, wonderful podcasts. She's even been portrayed by the likes of Hilary Swank and Amy Adams, two award-winning actors of high regard. Okay, being honest, Hilary Swank, the movie she was in, Amelia, not really a critical dynamo movie. She was a great casting choice, though. Critics said that it felt like a surface-level depiction of events we already knew about and didn't quite bother to explore the depth of the woman behind them. Fair critique. Because, Amelia wasn't just a pilot. She was a speaker, an author, an advocate, fashion designer, a consultant, an educator. She was the whole plane, not just the propeller. Her story continues to be told not because we lost her, but because of what we gained from her. Women must try to do things just as men have tried. When they fail, their failure must be but a challenge to others. That's what she said. And that's what she did. She never needed to finish that final flight to prove anything. Her legacy was already cruising at altitude, so wherever she ended up, in the sea, on a reef, or somewhere only history knows, Amelia Earhart still flying, not on radar, but in legacy and in the hearts of those who dared to dream. I hope you all found this as interesting as I did. I also hope that I did not bore you to death with the history of aviation in the beginning. I wanted to make sure you had an understanding of, the burgeoning technology that she was a part of as she grew, right? There's so much to her story and the story of those around her. I also do kind of feel bad because Fred Noonan gets talked about only ever so briefly as like an afterthought when it comes to Amelia, and I think he just gets lost in most of the conversation. So I wanted to give the little tip of the cap to him, and that's why I included his brief bio in the episode as well. If you did enjoy it, let me know. You can leave comments in the various social media options we have. All can be found in the description, or just search The Remedial Scholar on any of them. Also, if you enjoyed it, please rate and review wherever possible. Tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, let me know why. Did I miss something? Mix up dates, numbers? Probably. I'm not flawless, as some of you may believe. Lastly, if you want me to cover something, please let me know. Always taking suggestions in the comments of YouTube, social media. You can comment on Spotify now. Also, there's a Linktree link in the description, or you can just Google Linktree Remedial Scholar, and there is a topic suggestion button. So, thank you to everyone who has followed me on this journey. I hope you're enjoying it and learning lots. Remember, keep questioning the past. The future will thank you. See you next time.